Great, Clayton. Yeah, I'm so glad that you're here. Thank you for making it. I know that yeah, the internet has not been kind today, but you made your way through and you made it. So thank you.
I'm so grateful to be a part of the whole event here and have been following it for some time. Of course, Ben and I go way back. So thanks for the patience of me shuffling a bunch of devices and URLs and platforms. I've been on StreamYard, Skype, WebEx, Zoom, all in one day, by the way. So it's great to be here.
Yeah, you have you've slogged through the jungle and the swamps and the desert, and now you're here with us, and I appreciate it so much. And yeah, I can't wait to hear what you have to talk about. I know you're coming from Silicon Harlem as the organization, and you're here to talk about proactive equity. And I will turn it over to you. Take it away.
Well, I thank you. It's such an important part of all of our lives moving forward, especially when you're seeing the amount of acceleration when it comes to technology, certainly even before the pandemic, but certainly after the pandemic, or as we are in the pandemic, depending on where you live in the country. But anyway, the point is we are accelerating in technology, in ideas, and certainly in startups, and all types of activity that's happening around the globe. And one of the things that I always have tried to advocate for is let's make this something where everyone can participate. It's everyone ought to participate. And there couldn't be more of a better example than XR. When you're looking at the XR universe, there's tremendous opportunities, whether it's business models, whether it's games, whether it's these type of events of coming together. There's so much potential here, but we could literally mess it up if we don't make it inclusive. And I'm a big proponent of that because I've seen it happen. I've been in the telecommunications industry for a long time, and I've seen the sort of ways that technology can get beyond people. And I have a solution. That's the beautiful. Yeah, I mean, people can all talk about the problems, and we do that a lot. Everyone, the problem, the digital divide, and that. That's cool. We all understand that more than ever, right? The pandemic said, yes, these are real issues. There's a what and the why. Why this has impact on all parts of life. So here's my formula for everyone. Are you ready for me?
I am going to go off camera so that you have full screen, so you have everybody's attention. So I will be back at the end of the talk, but I'm going to give it to you. All right.
You, and I won't be that long, but thank you, Trevor Flowers. I appreciate you.
Happy to do it.
I'd like everyone to take one moment and take a look at my theory and see if we can't work together in the future to change the trajectory of the world, right? So it's a simple formula, and it's from the beginning of time. And it goes like this. I call it the story of the gaps. The story of the gaps. So it's a simple formula. If you do not have exposure to something or anything, you have what's called an exposure gap. You're not getting exposed to certain things, right? I, for example, have been all over the world, right? So when we ask somebody, hey, let's talk about Singapore, and that person's never been there, they have a lack of exposure. They have a gap in exposure. Or we can take it even simpler into our country here where we say, or in America anyway, where people in low income, for example, may have never been to a golf course. So that exposure is not there for them. And if you have an exposure gap, it leads to an access gap, right? So from an exposure gap, meaning I have no idea what XR is, I'd even never heard of XR. If somebody says that to you, the question is, who's going to give them exposure to that, right? And if we say, well, you know what, maybe they won't understand it, maybe they're not into that, whatever the case may be, we create our self-inflicted exposure gap. With the exposure gap means you haven't access gap. So if you have an exposure gap, it leads to an access gap. And if you don't have access to the tools like WebXR and others, you're not going to be in the game. You're not going to be in the economic trajectory that can go. So from an exposure gap creates an access gap, right? So if there's an access gap, guess what the ultimate happens? It creates what I call, and what you call, and what everyone calls the wealth gap. An exposure gap leads to an access gap, which leads to a wealth gap. Wealth gap is one a lot of us don't like talking about, right? We know it's there, but we really don't want to talk about it because it's easier to talk about like digital divide or something like that. But wealth gap is the real challenge. So so what's the solution, Clayton? That sounds pretty interesting, profound in some ways. Maybe we'll submit your name to some op-ed or whatever. But here's the deal. Here's a simple thing to do. Give everybody some exposure. I mean, right? If you start at the beginning and give people exposure, I can guarantee you they will come up with the same energy, ideas, and commitment that all of us on this call have to things like XR. You got to give them the exposure. That doesn't mean a handout, doesn't mean anything else except why do these schools have kids working in that space and other schools don't. Let's make that much more available to everyone, any type of, especially in my prism of technology, especially in that space. And here's an example of why I know this works. So I recently, when I say recently, it was 2.5 years ago. So 2.5 years ago, and Ben Irwin knows this, we created the very first 5G testbed in the country, in Harlem. That testbed went from Columbia University to City College along Broadway. And it is an extraordinary, it's still up to this day and it's still doing its thing. The reality is, why putting that inside the community, we also said, why don't we go to some of the public schools and actually share and give some exposure to what we're doing. And not only did we do that in terms of going in and talking with the teachers and talking with students and et cetera. So there's in a lot of ways was a very struggling public school system in this particular area. And we ended up actually even creating curriculum, train the teachers so that the teachers can then give lessons to the students. We gave them tools, all types of things to work with as a result. On our test bed, companies like IBM and others are running radios and various applications on our test bed because it's the only one you can really do it. All the stuff you see on TV and commercials and all that, that's all a bunch of hype. But you got to really do the research behind it. That's why we were so committed. But think about what I'm saying. When IBM calls us and says, hey, we want to run this on your platform because of the speed and the latency, and they can see how autonomous and virtual things work. But now, those kids in that public school system, where STEM isn't necessarily the top of the line there, have now got exposure to a test bed of advanced wireless connectivity that is built for speed and low latency. So when the kids say to me, Mr. Banks, we would love to run an application on your service. We figured out how to use VR to get to the best restaurants in our neighborhood that are friendly to teenagers. And guess what? I will say, sure, why not? Now, if you hear what I'm saying, IBM and the kids from the school are running on the same test bed. It opens their prism from wherever they thought they were going to I have more options. Why? Because we all together provide that exposure. In fact, they're ahead of the best schools, right? So from this struggling school system, all of a sudden from that exposure, has more access than any other students in the city. And that access is exactly what we all have on this call, which is being able to connect with each other right here, start thinking about different ideas, applications, and services. And then boom, we start making money on those applications. This is what I'm hoping to share with everyone on this call. This is not you like saying, oh, let me do some nice things. No, just expose people to stuff. That's my thing. If you give the exposure, the access will allow them to, blossom. And we close the wealth gap. I read a statistic recently, and I'm not an identity type of guy, but the statistic ran me crazy. So I already knew that the wealth gap in this country from particularly African Americans and white Americans, which I hate using both those terms. I really do. I don't like it. But when you look at the statistics, it has been the same wealth gap since the 50s. But more importantly, which means it's been systemic and sustainable. And according to this research that was done, that the closing of the gap that is currently in place would take 238 years. I'm like, what? That's why I had to be like, we've got to figure this out now. Most of us won't be around 238 years from now, right? So let's try to finish this one right now with simply doing exposure. I'm very proud of one of my best friends, Ben Irwin, who has placed this in the middle of this developer summit. I know how much we want to get back to, all the cool stuff that's happening in XR, and I'm down with it. I'm just as geeky as everybody. Ben knows I've been in this a long time. VR, AR, XR. I'm all in. I got my goggles around here somewhere. They're never that far away from me, but I always appreciate that. However, it won't be as beautiful and as successful if we don't get everybody involved, no matter where they're from, poor or rich. We got to get everyone at that table because the best ideas are yet to come. And then let me give my last sample, GPS, right? Does anyone remember before we had no GPS? GPS? Really? I mean, that has been transformative for the world. Has it, attributed over $1 trillion to the American economy? Well, again, haven't we really just scratched the surface with that? Why? Because many of our population haven't had the time to get back on or get that exposure. So for the next big stuff that's happening, which I call space technology, let's make sure everyone has that exposure. I want to say thank you for everybody, whoever stayed on here and listened to me. I appreciate it. I don't know if I'm able to put my email in the chat, but I will, and it's mr.banks@siliconharlem.com. Mr. Banks@siliconharlem.com.
Amazing. You have such a great energy. It's wonderful to hear this from you, Clayton, and also a very, very different perspective from some of the other talks that we've had today. So,
well, if there's any questions I can address, I'm happy to take any questions. I know I went a little longer than I probably should have, but if there's any questions, even if you want to just email them to me, I'm happy to respond.
Absolutely. We did have the question link, but we haven't heard it. I think everybody was just, immersed in your energy. At least I was. It was great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here today, too.
Thank you very much, and have a great rest of your summit.
Great. All right. Thank you. And if anybody wants to reach out to Clayton, he's dropped his email in the chat there, or somebody has dropped your email in there. So you're all good. You're all good. All right. Thank you so much, Clayton.
Thank you all. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Trevor. Thanks, Ben. Thanks for all the people in the backstage. Thank you.
Amazing. Amazing.
Thank you.